The ancient backyard pond that could feed a family for generations. Imagine walking into your backyard early in the morning when the air is still cool and the ground is covered with dew. Birds are singing somewhere in the distance while sunlight slowly begins touching the trees and grass around your home. In one quiet corner of the garden, there's a small pond filled with still water and surrounded by green plants. At first glance, the pond looks completely ordinary. Maybe a few fish are swimming quietly beneath the surface while insects hover above the water searching for places to land. A couple of ducks drift slowly across the pond as ripples spread outward in soft circles. Most people would simply see it as decoration, a peaceful garden feature designed to make the backyard feel calm and beautiful. But hidden inside that small pond is one of the oldest and most efficient food systems humans have ever discovered. That tiny ecosystem could quietly produce food for years without needing industrial machines or constant human control. It does not rely on expensive fertilizers, massive electricity usage, or complicated technology to survive. Instead, it depends on a natural cycle that nature itself has already perfected over millions of years. Long before supermarkets existed, long before industrial agriculture covered entire countries, ancient civilizations already understood something modern society has mostly forgotten. Water itself can become a living food system when the right balance is allowed to develop naturally. A properly designed pond can produce fish, eggs, edible plants, fertilizer, and even support nearby crops at the same time. The surprising part is how little the system actually needs from humans. Sunlight powers plant growth while microorganisms recycle nutrients automatically inside the water. Fish feed on insects, algae, plankton, and tiny living organisms already produced by the ecosystem itself. For thousands of years, families across Asia quietly depended on ponds like these for survival. Some ponds lasted for generations and were passed from parents to children, just like farmland or houses. Entire communities built their lives around ecosystems that modern people barely even know exist today. And strangely enough, history suggests those systems were often far more sustainable than many modern food systems we depend on now. They required fewer outside resources while continuing to produce food year after year. Nature handled most of the difficult work automatically as long as humans respected the balance of the ecosystem. More than 2,400 years ago, a Chinese statesman and farmer named Fan Li described systems like these in an ancient text called the Classic of Fish Culture. According to his writings, a properly balanced pond could produce more useful protein than livestock raised on the same amount of land. And once the ecosystem stabilized, it could continue functioning for decades with surprisingly little effort. At first, this sounds almost impossible to modern ears. Most people today assume food production must involve huge farms, expensive infrastructure, and constant labor. But ancient farmers discovered something very different. Nature already knows how to build efficient systems. Humans simply forgot how to cooperate with them. How ancient farmers accidentally discovered the system. To understand how these ponds were created, we need to travel back thousands of years near the Yellow River in ancient China. Long before modern science existed, early farming communities depended completely on seasonal weather patterns and river floods for survival. Every year, floodwaters spread across large areas of land before slowly retreating back into the river system. But after the water disappeared, something unusual remained behind. Small depressions in the ground stayed filled with water while isolated pools formed naturally across the landscape. Inside those pools, fish became trapped after the floods receded. At first, people assumed the fish would die once disconnected from the river. Instead, the fish survived surprisingly well inside the isolated pools. They fed on algae, insects, and tiny organisms already present in the water, while continuing to grow larger over time. For early villagers struggling to secure stable food sources, this discovery was incredibly important. Instead of traveling long distances to rivers or lakes, Families could simply collect fish directly from nearby pools whenever food was needed. Nature itself had accidentally created a natural food storage system. Naturally, humans began experimenting with the idea. Farmers dug the pools deeper so they would hold water longer during dry seasons. They reinforced the edges using packed clay to reduce leakage and protect the pond structure. Over time, they discovered something remarkable. If a pond remained deep enough and balanced enough, fish could survive there permanently. Some species even reproduced naturally inside the ponds without requiring humans to restock them constantly. This was not agriculture in the modern sense. Humans were not forcing nature to behave unnaturally through chemicals or machinery. They were simply observing how ecosystems already functioned and slowly learning how to cooperate with them. The ponds worked because nature wanted them to work. And once ancient farmers understood that principle, the entire system began evolving rapidly. The first household fish farms. By around 1600 BCE, during the Shang dynasty, fish ponds had already become a recognized part of agricultural life in many areas. Archaeologists later discovered inscriptions carved into ancient oracle bones, describing activities translated as fishing in the garden. At first, historians assumed the phrase was symbolic or poetic. Later research revealed something much more interesting. Families were literally maintaining productive fish ponds directly inside household gardens. Some ponds raised ornamental fish for wealthy households, while others focused entirely on food production. For ordinary families, these ponds became extremely valuable. Crops could fail because of storms, droughts, or insect damage, but ponds often continued producing fish even during difficult seasons when farmland struggled. Fish provided reliable protein at a time when meat was often difficult to obtain consistently. In some regions, ponds became one of the most important food sources available to households. Families carefully maintained them year after year because survival sometimes depended on them. As people spent more time observing pond ecosystems, they noticed another important pattern. The healthiest ponds were not the ones humans controlled aggressively. The best ponds were the ones where balance was allowed to develop naturally between plants, fish, insects, algae, and microorganisms. Ancient farmers may not have understood ecology scientifically, but they understood it practically. They realized living organisms inside the pond depended on one another in ways that created stability over time. When balance remained intact, the system almost seemed capable of maintaining itself automatically. That realization slowly changed how humans thought about food production itself. Instead of controlling nature completely, people learned to cooperate with it. The imperial ban that changed aquaculture forever. Centuries later, during the Tang dynasty, an unusual political event unexpectedly transformed fish farming history forever. The ruling emperor's family name was Li, and in ancient Chinese pronunciation, the word for carp sounded extremely similar. According to traditions at the time, raising or killing something associated with the imperial name could be considered disrespectful. Eventually, restrictions on carp farming spread through parts of the empire. For farmers, this created a serious problem. Carp had served as one of the primary fish species for more than 1,000 years. Losing access to carp threatened food production across many communities. But instead of abandoning fish ponds, farmers adapted creatively. They began raising multiple fish species together inside the same ecosystem rather than depending on only one type of fish. Some species fed near the water surface while consuming insects and floating plants. Others lived deeper in the pond, filtering algae or plankton from the water. Certain species fed near the muddy bottom where organic material collected naturally. Suddenly, every layer of the pond became productive at the same time. Instead of competing heavily for the same food, different fish species used completely different ecological niches. Waste decreased while overall productivity increased dramatically. Without realizing it, ancient farmers had accidentally created one of the earliest forms of polyculture aquaculture in world history. Modern scientists would later confirm how biologically efficient this system truly was. Each species supported overall ecosystem balance rather than weakening it. The pond itself became smarter. Villages built around water. Ecosystems. As centuries passed, fish ponds spread across many Asian villages and farming communities. Travelers visiting these regions often described entire landscapes filled with ponds surrounded by plants, fish, ducks, and gardens. Some ponds had existed continuously for generations. Families inherited them from parents and grandparents just like houses or farmland. In certain villages, ponds were considered among the most valuable household resources because they reliably produced food year after year. Outside observers were often shocked by how simple the systems looked. Farmers were not carrying huge amounts of feed to the ponds every day. There were no electric pumps, industrial filters, or complex machines maintaining the ecosystem. And yet the ponds continued producing fish continuously. The reason was simple but powerful. These ponds functioned as complete ecosystems instead of artificial farming operations. Sunlight fueled algae growth while algae supported plankton and microscopic organisms. Fish consumed those organisms while fish waste fertilized aquatic plants. Plants absorbed nutrients and stabilized water quality naturally. Everything inside the ecosystem recycled itself. The pond did not need constant outside support because nature handled most of the work automatically. In many ways, the pond functioned more like a tiny living world than a farm, and as long as humans respected the balance of the system, it could continue producing food for decades or even centuries. How modern society forgot this knowledge. When industrial agriculture later spread across Europe and North America, farming changed dramatically. Large livestock systems became the dominant model for producing food. Cattle, pigs, and chickens required fenced land, constant feeding, transportation systems, medicine, barns, and industrial infrastructure. Food production became centralized and increasingly dependent on outside inputs. Efficiency focused on size and industrial scale rather than ecological balance. Gradually, ponds stopped being viewed as household food systems. In many countries, ponds became decorative landscape features instead. People filled them with ornamental koi fish or fountains designed purely for beauty. Backyard ponds still looked peaceful, but they no longer fed families. Over time, the ancient knowledge behind self-sustaining pond ecosystems slowly disappeared from public awareness. Entire generations grew up believing food production must always involve large industrial systems. But nature itself never forgot how the process worked, and eventually modern scientists rediscovered the truth. The scientific rediscovery. During the 1960s, concerns about food shortages and sustainable agriculture pushed researchers to revisit older farming ideas. Scientists at Auburn University in Alabama became especially interested in whether small ponds could function as efficient household food systems again. Instead of constructing giant commercial fish farms, they created simple backyard-sized ponds for experimentation. Most ponds measured roughly 1,000 square feet, with moderate depth similar to small swimming pools. Researchers stocked the ponds with hardy fish species including bluegill and channel catfish. They expected modest results at best, but what happened next surprised them greatly. The ponds produced remarkably high amounts of edible fish relative to their size. Some systems generated around 350 pounds of fish annually while requiring minimal external feeding. Compared to livestock farming, the ponds proved extremely efficient. Cattle farming often required huge land areas, expensive feed, medicine, fencing, and constant labor. The ponds, however, relied mostly on biological processes already occurring naturally inside the water. The ecosystem itself produced much of the fish's food, Sunlight powered algae growth while algae supported plankton and microorganisms. Fish consumed those organisms while waste recycled back into nutrients for plants. The pond was not simply storing fish. It was manufacturing food continuously through natural ecological cycles. Modern science had rediscovered what ancient farmers understood thousands of years earlier. The 4 components of a self-sustaining pond. Every successful pond ecosystem depends on several interconnected biological components working together in balance. Remove one important component, and the system becomes weaker and less stable. The first component is ducks. Ducks do far more than simply provide eggs or meat. As they swim across the pond surface, they disturb soft sediment at the bottom and release trapped nutrients into the water. Duck manure contains nitrogen, one of the most important nutrients for algae growth. Once algae begin growing, they form the base of the entire food chain inside the pond. Ducks essentially help fuel the ecosystem itself. The second component is aquatic plants. Plants such as duckweed, cattails, and water lilies absorb excess nutrients while naturally filtering the water. They provide shade, stabilize temperature, and create shelter for fish and insects. Duckweed is especially valuable because it grows extremely quickly and contains high levels of protein. Fish and ducks both consume it eagerly as a natural food source. Under favorable conditions, duckweed can double its biomass within just a few days. The third component is fish. Different species serve different ecological functions inside the pond. Bluegill reproduce efficiently and maintain stable populations naturally. Catfish tolerate difficult conditions while feeding near the bottom, where organic material collects. Tilapia grow rapidly while converting algae and plant material into edible protein efficiently. Together, these species create a balanced system where every ecological layer contributes productively. The fourth and perhaps most important component is beneficial bacteria. Although invisible to the human eye, these microorganisms quietly process waste through the nitrogen cycle. They transform toxic ammonia into less harmful compounds that plants can safely absorb as nutrients. Without beneficial bacteria, the ecosystem would collapse quickly. They are the hidden engine supporting everything else inside the pond. Building a backyard food ecosystem. One of the most surprising facts about these systems is how little space they actually require. A relatively small pond can already support meaningful biological productivity if designed correctly. A pond measuring roughly 10 feet by 15 feet with moderate depth is often enough to begin establishing ecological balance. Construction costs are usually far lower than people expect. Basic startup materials include a waterproof liner, aquatic plants, starter fish, and optionally ducks depending on the design. After the ecosystem stabilizes, maintenance becomes surprisingly minimal. Sunlight powers the system naturally every single day without cost. Over time, microorganisms multiply while plants establish roots and insects arrive around the water automatically. Slowly, the pond transforms into a living ecosystem capable of supporting itself. But patience is essential. Nature does not build balance instantly. During the first several months, water conditions may fluctuate while algae and microorganisms stabilize. Plants develop stronger roots while nutrient cycles slowly become established. After about 1 year, many fish reach harvestable size. By the second year, fish populations often begin reproducing naturally inside the pond. At this stage, the ecosystem starts maintaining itself without requiring constant human involvement. By the third year, the pond no longer feels like a farming project. It feels alive. The real meaning behind the pond. But perhaps the most important part of this entire system is not simply the fish or food production itself. The deeper value is independence. Modern food systems depend heavily on transportation networks, industrial farms, refrigeration systems, fuel supplies, and complex global logistics. Most people are completely disconnected from the actual production of their own food. A backyard pond ecosystem changes that relationship. It reconnects humans directly with nature's ability to provide sustenance, and, maybe even more importantly, it changes the way people think about survival itself. Ancient civilizations understood something modern society often forgets. Nature does not always need to be dominated or controlled aggressively. Sometimes nature only needs cooperation. A small pond, sunlight, water, living organisms, patience. Those simple elements are enough to create an ecosystem capable of producing food for years. And perhaps that is the most surprising lesson of all. The most powerful systems are not always the loudest, biggest, or most technologically advanced. Sometimes the strongest systems are the quiet ones that have already worked successfully for thousands of years.